So my goal has always been to work with large corporations, and that's been the focus of my career. But in all of these cases, the corporations have a very strong identity, brand identity, and so when they had problems, they wanted it fixed. They didn't want the problems in the first place. And so now I'm kind of working on the other side with community groups and with local townships, counties, etc. I've got 45 years of experience. I'm a full member of the Institute of Noise Control Engineering. I'm president of I was president of James Anderson Associates. This was the firm that we put together in the 80s through the time I retired in 2006. We dealt with not only the automotive industry, we dealt with the brewing industry, John Deere, people basically that have large manufacturing plants, employee noise problems, and community noise problems. And our mandate was to make those problems stay out of the papers. More recently, I'm an adjunct professor at Central Michigan University and was an adjunct instructor at Michigan State University from 1985 to 2013. I published papers on the topics of wind turbines, covering how to properly site wind turbines. That was done in 2008. Measurement of infrasound, which was done in 2011, and the adverse health effects of wind turbines, a paper that was written in 2012. The 2012 paper was in a peer-reviewed journal, and it gives the history of how wind turbine noise was identified as a potential community issue, in-home issue back in the 1980s, and that this information has been basically ignored by the wind industry from the year 2000 forward. I've been qualified in hearings and legal proceedings in the US, Canada, New Zealand, as an expert in measurement and the impact of wind turbine noise on people and communities. And by that I say, if people have heard my name, a lot of times when it's associated with wind developers, it's in a very negative fashion. Kind of like Kevin said, he's accused of working for the Koch brothers. My work, if it was biased, would never have passed court scrutiny. And so when in a court where honesty and facts count, I'm considered to be an unbiased source of information for the court. And that has happened in repeated court cases, including some that have involved energy. The highest hurdle in U.S. courts is that a defendant can challenge an expert and say that what they are producing is junk science. This is due to a Supreme Court decision on a number of years ago. Let's see if I can get this a little laser to go. Several years ago in the case up in McBain, Michigan, I was challenged. This forces the judge to have to listen to whether or not I am independent, qualified, biased, and make a decision. It isn't before a jury, it's before a judge. In all of the Daubert hearings, I have been considered an expert qualified to present my opinions to the court. So let's come back to the topic of wind turbine noise. I use this graphic as a way to really show what happens when wind turbines are active. We're really not focusing on the noise of the gears or the noise of the components in a wind turbine. It is the noise produced as the air moves into the blades and then comes out with turbulence. And as we can see here, right behind the tower, and up here near the tower, we have these red areas. And that's because at those places, the wind and the tower begin to interact, not just the blades. The sounds that we hear from wind turbines, the swishing sounds, the whooshing sounds, the sounds that sound like a distant highway or an airplane, come from the blades as they move through the air. The sounds that are associated with infrasound, which I'm going to focus on here in a bit, are as the air comes towards the blade at the bottom, the blades are bent back. The blades are under load, so they're bent back. As the blade comes right in front of the tower, the air is a little bit calmer, allowing that blade to move forward, relax. That sends out a pulse of air. So every time as the blade comes through the bottom, we get a pulse of sound that's very, very low frequency, below your ability to hear it. What people will respond to is they'll say, I feel pressure in my ear. I feel like I'm dizzy. I feel motion sickness. They're not related to auditory, but some kind of feeling that they have. And I'll explain how that happens here in a bit. So anyway, this is a good diagram. Anytime you're behind the wind turbine, you're in the highest noise area, and it is this turbulence that is producing the sound. Kevin touched on it briefly. The World Health Organization updated their guidelines for nighttime noise. It was in a document that was funded by the European community, and the funding was very adequate. They were allowed to redo a number of studies. Their focus wasn't wind turbines, it was on highway noise, airport noise, and industrial noise. But one of the things that they found was the old guidelines, which set 45 dBA as being acceptable, were incorrect. They found that there were adverse health effects, particularly for people that live near highways and airports, from low frequency sound that start, there we go, that start at about 30 dB up to 40 for the most sensitive, vulnerable groups. As Kevin said, children, chronically ill, and the elderly. At 40 dB, adverse health effects are observed among the exposed populations, and many people have to adopt their lives to cope with noise at night. Vulnerable groups now are more severely affected. So what has happened over the last 11 or 4 or 5 years is that 40 dBA has become the not to exceed level that is recommended at night. 40 dBA has even been accepted by acousticians who formerly worked for the wind industry. And to give you an example of that is when I first approached the issue of Michigan Wind 1 in Hubley back in 2007, the acoustician working for Noble Environmental, the company putting in that development, was a young man, or a guy about my age, called David Hessler. Dave and his father, George, have a company that has been very active with wind developers. At that time, Dave said 55 dBA was acceptable. And he convinced the zoning board that it was, and Michigan Wind 1 got the permit. Since that time, they have learned through complaints and other work that 55 is not acceptable. And they now agree that 40 dBA is the acceptable limit, and Kevin had a slide on that. So even the acousticians who've been working for the wind industry, who are honest enough to talk about the facts and their experience, now go towards 40 and not 55. Excuse me. The other thing is, when we're looking at nighttime noise, the industry tends to say, well, the noise from outside gets blocked coming in because you have your windows closed or partly closed. That isn't always true. A lot of people like to live with their windows open or sleep with their windows open. For that matter, they have a right to sleep on their patio if they want to. And so nighttime noise really needs to look at the actual limits of 40 and 30 dBA as being the goals. When there's low frequency, and that is what we call rumble or roar, rumble being like you would get from a cement truck idling in your driveway. That kind of deep rumble, you almost feel it, but you can still hear it. Then dBA limits aren't enough. You look at dBc, which includes in the measurement the low frequency sounds. And here's some of the things that WHO has said about that over the past 20-some years. They say, it should be noted that low frequency noise can disturb rest and sleep even at low sound pressure levels. A large proportion of low frequency components increases annoyance. Health effects due to low frequency components in noise are estimated to be more severe than for community noise levels in general. If the noise includes a large proportion of low frequency components, lower guidelines should be applied. Where noise is continuous, as a wind turbine would be, the equivalent sound pressure level should not exceed 30 dBA indoors. I'll skip part of that. Where prominent low frequency components are present, noise measures based on dBA are inappropriate. It should be noted that a large proportion of low frequency components increases considerably the adverse effects. And their major statement is the evidence is that low frequency noise is sufficiently strong to warrant immediate concern, and wind turbines, by definition, are sources of low frequency noise. Just looking at the audible components, we can see some interesting things. This is a study that was done in Europe where they associated annoyance of people to wind turbines. And the graph that I like to draw your attention to is up here. And what this shows is as the sound level gets large, increases from 35 dBA up to 55, annoyance, 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60%. At about 40 dBA, 10% of all the people would be annoyed. Now, there's several other charts on here. One is rail, one is airports, one is industry. But up here we have this other chart, this dashed line, and that's a railroad shunting yard. And I think for those that are familiar with that, that's where you bring in a long train, and the shunting engines then will break it up, recombine it, so that part of the cars go north, part goes south, parts go east. It's bang, clatter, rumble, etc. The only type of noise that is more annoying than wind turbine noise is shunting yard noise. And at 40 dBA, 10% will find that annoying. At 40 dBA over here, this is highly annoyed. Annoyed is, it bothers you enough that you complain about it. Highly annoyed is where you hire an attorney to sue someone. So when you get to that level, again we see the black dots are response. Only 5% may be highly annoyed, but again, the only thing that's more annoying is living near a shunting yard. So now let's look at the low frequency. What's producing this infrasound that I talk about? As the blades turn, and this is a picture that was produced by Esther Reitman, who lives in Ontario, for a court case in Ontario to explain to the hearing officers what was happening. We have the wind moving through the turbine blades. As the blade passes the tower, we have a pressure change causing the blade to snap forward a bit, and we get thump, 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 thump. Except instead of hearing it, you're feeling it. You feel it either in your chest, maybe translated as motion. One of these pressure changes can cause the balance system to detect what they believe is motion when it's really just a pressure change. And then the brain says, well, we must have just gotten off of a Ferris wheel or an entertainment ride or whatever. So, so anyway, the thumping has a characteristic. This chart shows is there's a burst of energy, quiet, burst of energy, quiet. And when you look at it through an analysis system, these are frequencies. The height is sound level, and this is 1 hertz, about 1 cycle per second. The Michigan Wind 1 turbines rotate at 20 RPM, which gives you a pulse every 1 second. So here's the tone. Those tones have harmonics, and so there's a characteristic chart that we'll see whenever we look at wind turbine blade noise. Some of the knowledge about infrasound, it isn't new. I've been accused of having novel ideas, novel meaning untested, that other people don't agree with me. In 1987, Dr. Neil Kelly, who retired from the National Renewable Energy Labs government agency as the manager of the solar power division, did a study where he demonstrated that the pulsating infrasound from wind turbines occurs at pressures far below the levels needed for audibility. The wind industry experts always argue that you need to exceed the threshold of audibility for infrasound for it to be perceived by the body. But we've known since 1987 that's not true. In 2009, Wade Bray, a colleague of mine, and I did a study of Michigan Wind 1 at the Poplinski residence, just north of Upley. And what we demonstrated was that wind turbines of the modern style used, called an upwind turbine, produced the same kind of pulses that were produced by the 1987 older style wind turbines. And we also demonstrated that you can't measure these sounds with standard instruments. A lot of acousticians have gone out, done tests, come back and say, I don't measure anything. It isn't because the sound wasn't there, it's because their instruments aren't capable of measuring it. In 2012, a team of experts was tasked with doing a study of Shirley wind in Brown County, Wisconsin. This was for the Public Service Commission. They used the same protocol that I used in the 2009 study, and they identified infrasound and associated with the complaints of adverse sensations and experiences of the people in those homes. In 2014, the Brown County Board of Health, which has been watching Shirley wind for about 5 or 6 years, declared that Shirley wind was a human health hazard. And this wasn't based upon my study, and some of the stories are that I convinced them based upon a bunch of wizardry. The doctor who was on the panel said that was only a small part of it. What convinced him was watching the health of the people in his community deteriorate, and they continue to deteriorate. So his response was as a doctor looking at patients, not as an acoustician looking at charts. Finally, there was another study done in Victoria, Australia. This followed the same procedures as the Shirley wind study and the Bray James study, and they found their study linked wind turbine blade pass infrasound to the sensations experienced by test subjects, including one test subject who was functionally deaf. And so auditory function is not part of it, it is a vestibular disturbance, much more like an out-of-control entertainment ride. So what is the result in Brown County? We now have, as I drove up here, I saw the signs, vote yes, vote no, vote yes, vote no. Well, after it's all done and people vote in a way that allows lenient limits for wind turbines, those can be replaced with signs that say, Duke Energy's Shirley wind turbines are a human health hazard, Brown County Board of Health. These signs are now posted at many homes in Brown County's Shirley wind area. Let's look at the limits. Here I'm looking at the primary issues of what's the setback to the home, what's the setback to a property line, how much can the new noise source increase the sound level over the pre-existing, and what is the audible limit, the low frequency limit, and an infrasound limit. I'd like to just touch here on this increased sound over pre-existing. One of the things that I have learned to value, I grew up in an area where I spent my summers in a very rural part of Wisconsin. Many of my relatives are dairy farmers. And one of the things I learned there is that it's very quiet in rural areas. What we call this in acoustics is the listening radius. How far, when I stand out at night, how far away can I hear the faintest sounds? Well, in a rural community, for example, when I was testing up here on Barometer Road for the Michigan Wind 1 project, I noticed that I could hear the cars coming to the stop sign on Upley and the east-west highway in downtown Upley, even though I was miles away from it. That's a great listening radius, and it's only possible when it's so quiet that there's nothing else to interfere. Now, if I go to my yard in suburban Lansing, in Okemos, I'm a mile north of a highway, a mile east of a major expressway, and I can't hear what's going on in the next block. So in an urban area, my listening radius may be a block, 2 blocks. In a rural area, my listening radius may be miles. So what happens when we put wind turbines into a community that has a listening radius of a mile or 2 miles, is we make it like a suburban community. It now is only a block or two. So now when you walk outside at night and you listen for the dogs or the neighbor's dog who is barking a half-mile away, that's gone. And in that sense, you have lost that quality of life. The same applies to birds, animals, etc. Birds and predators rely on listening radius. You want to hear the hawk's wings if you're a bunny rabbit? Close and far enough away that you can get out of the way. As the sound level goes up, you hear less, you become food instead of hopping off for another life. Listening radius is very important, and it affects how the animals will propagate, and it affects how your quality of life will occur. So, my recommendations are that for setbacks to a home, we have none. That's not the proper place. It should be to the property line. 1.25 miles is 6,600 feet. We calculated that back in 2008 when I presented the first paper on siting wind turbines for public health, and it has been now adopted by many communities around the world. Only a 5 dB increase. This means you'll hear the wind turbines, but they aren't going to be the dominant aspect of the community. That for any home or sensitive reception like a hospital, school, etc., that the limit be 35 dBA at that home. But this isn't the controlling factor. The controlling factor would be the 6,600 feet. Low frequency sounds should be limited to 50 dB. And for infrasound, and I'll show you what I mean by sum of tones, those should also be limited to 50 dB. Moore's standard is 1,320 feet to the home, approximately 750 to the property line, and the increase in background sound can be as much as 50 dB with 45 plus 5 phrasing in the standard. Audible sounds are limited to 45, which remember are above the World Health Organization limit for adverse health effects, so public health is not protected. There's no standards for low frequency, which the World Health Organization said were very important, and there's nothing for infrasound. When we look at infrasound from wind turbines, we're looking at the tones caused by the blade passing the tower, and when I look at my charts, when the turbines are turning, there's tones. When the turbines aren't turning, there aren't, and I'll show you some examples. Natural infrasound, a lot of times the industry will say, well, there's natural infrasound everywhere. There is, but it doesn't have tones. And I'll give you some examples of this in a second. Kind of instruments necessary. I have two sets. One is a microbarometer, which I'll give you an example of here, and that's basically the same kind of tools that have been used for testing in Cold War to detect distant nuclear bomb or volcanoes and earthquakes. It's a durable, relatively inexpensive way to do testing. The more precise foam microphones, for example, the ones I use are called Gras 40 AZs. They're very delicate. They're damaged if you drop them. They're $2,500 to replace them. Whereas I can buy a whole microbarometer set up twice for the cost of one of my microphones. This right here gives me the same kind of analysis, but it's much more difficult to do. The other thing we found in acoustics is that people, particularly certain people who are sensitive, are better instruments for detecting these sounds than the best of these instruments. Dr. Malcolm Swinbanks, an acoustician from Britain, has a home here in Huron County. He happens to not only be the person that holds the patents on how to silence large jet engines, a lot of military equipment that where we're protecting our soldiers, but he also happens to be someone who can feel these sounds. And so not only can he use his instruments, but he can use his body. And he is more sensitive than the instruments. The two instruments I'm talking about, over here we have a microphone. This is a microbarometer. The microphone is very delicate, susceptible to a lot of types of damage, has to be calibrated every time we use it. The microbarometer looks like a small metal box. You can drive a truck over it and not hurt it. We basically mount it in a location where people would say, this is where I feel it, and we can compare those two readings. And this is what we get. This is a chart from my home. Let me explain this a bit. This part up here shows the pressure in my home, just as a series of spikes. There's no analysis going on. The more important charts are this one down here on the bottom, and this one up on top. So on the bottom, what we're looking at is time. This is the start of the test. And we go on here for about 20 hours. And during that time, there's this tone, and this is related to a fan that I have in my room that cycles. It's one of these oscillating fans and moves back and forth. And I can pick that up as this tone that's steady for the whole fret time. But you'll notice that for the higher frequencies, it's pretty much empty. There's nothing going on. So this is normal infrasound in a home. If I look at it, if I take this little band of it that's in highlight, and I analyze it, I can get a chart showing the frequencies, and we're at about 40 to just below 50 dB. And other than for that tone from my fan, it's pretty boring. This little spike down here is all homes have a resonant frequency. Like if you take a bottle, it's empty, and you blow over it, you'll get a tune or a tone out of it. Every room has its own tone. And for my home, this is where that tone exists. Well, what happens when we look at wind turbines outside my home? Well, or outside someone else's home. Here we have the same kind of chart. And what I'm showing here is the start of the test. This was at the INCE home, the INCE farm home in Shirley Wind, one of the homes that's been studied more than about any other place in the U.S. The start of the test on Friday night to the end of the test on Saturday morning on July 12, 2014. The tones from the wind turbines are these bands. You see these horizontal stripes. At this point, it's kind of interesting because there's about 8 wind turbines in that community. And here what we see is, as some of the wind turbines slow down, causing the tone to drop, while others stayed at the normal rate. And so you can see that some of the turbines came in, they drop off, whoops. They're operating steady, some of them then slow down, and we can actually see that in the chart. We can calculate the exact frequency of the RPM of the wind turbine by analyzing these charts. But what I really want to point out is what happens when they stop. Over here on Saturday morning, the turbine stopped. And suddenly what we're looking at is the same thing I have in my home without any wind turbines. So when people say this infrasound is all make-believe, no, it's very easy, it's measurable, and the difference between living with wind turbines is having these tones and not having those tones. The fact that those tones, here they're seen as the spikes on a curve, rise up above the background is what makes them more detectable to the ear. What we don't see in here is that these tones aren't steady. They're pulsing up and down. They're rapidly rising and falling. And that's where we get this pulsation that we feel. Here we see, this is the analysis done with the microphones. And again, here's our tones, now as the red lines coming across. The spikes that we see are here. This is the dominant frequency for the Shirley wind, and harmonics sitting out there. And I'm hoping to give a little video of this in a moment. This is what happens when the wind turbines are off, the tones go away. So it's very clear. There is a distinct difference, and that difference is something that some people can sense. Does it happen in places other than Shirley Wind? Back in 2013, Bob McLean and I were trying out microbarometers, and we took one to the home of a person who lives in Minden Township near the project in that area. We left it for a number of hours. I think we have about 6 hours. We have about 6 hours from here to here. And again, we see the tones from the turbines near his home. Here are the tones, the spikes, and we see that they rise up to just about 50, 55 dBA in there. So yes, even the turbines here in Minden Township are doing the same thing. Right. Here's a close-up just showing the tones. And again, this is the tone from the blade passing the tower and the blade snapping forward. Here's the harmonics from those tones.
Rick, I'd like to add that that gentleman's home where I did that test is unable to get a good night's sleep in that home.
Okay. Now, what I'm hoping for is that this will play. Let's see if Kevin can start it. Because, yep, we got it there, Kevin. What I'm going to show you here is what I mean by pulsating our tones. I call it dynamically modulated infrasound. Okay, there we go. Here we're seeing a close-up of the blade pass tone. These are the harmonics. And you can see that they're fluctuating just about the same rhythm as the wind turbine blades would be going by. We can see it also over here in this chart. This blue bar shows, you'll see that rising and falling, and the other bars. This is what I mean by dynamic modulation. And these pressure changes are going through your body, through your home, through your auditory system. One of my clients, in fact, I first saw this over at the Koblinski residence, uses a little bowl of water in one of those, I think it's a temple bowl, where if you run your finger on the rim, you can get tones out of it. When the wind turbines are running, he gets ripples in that water. We are all bags of skin filled with water. So if we're going to see ripples in the water of a bowl on a table, we're getting the same ripples in our fluids in our body. We have all these sensors that detect whether we're standing, whether we're sitting, whether we're feeling pressure, whether we're not feeling pressure, and all of those are getting this stimulation. That has nothing to do with movement, even though normally they would only occur if we were moving. So this is what I mean by dynamically modulated infrasound. And let's see if we can you click on that and just move it so we advance. And let's see this one. I had two different examples, and then I'm going to be done and we can go on to the next person. This is a different type of graph on the top, but you can still see the tones down here in these low frequencies, infrasound frequencies. There, for example, is the tone for the blade pass, and it rises and falls in a slow rhythm. So, for anybody who says it's all in someone's head, if they're complaining about these pressure pulses, it is in their head, but it's because the energy has gotten to the inside of their head. It's not because they're making it up. It's not because they have some other problem. It is real. It's measurable. And for a certain aspect of people, it's very debilitating. Now, the one thing I want to relate that to is motion sickness, because many of these things are related to that phenomenon. If I'm on a party boat and the ocean's rough, there'll be about 90% of those people that are sitting in the party room eating, drinking, and having a good time, while 10% of them are at the back, nauseated. So it shouldn't be surprising for us to understand that some people have more sensitive detectors for motion than others do. It isn't a matter of just who's a tough guy, because even the tough guys can end up at the back rail. It's if you happen to have the more sensitive receptors, you're going to have a reaction. It isn't anything that's an illness, it is just a more sensitive reaction. But for that party boat, the ride gets over, you go home and everything's fine. If you're living in a home with infrasound pulsations, it goes on nighttime, day after day after day. Someone said, well, what's wrong with a few pressure pulsations in the ear? I get it when I go up and down in an airplane. I get it when I go up and down on hills, if the hill's steep enough. But if that was every day, every night, that'd be a different thing. So the kind of problems we're talking about are not big medical issues. It is the consistency, the repeatability, and the fact that they don't go away unless you leave the area or the turbines turn off. And that's what I want to close with. This is about protecting people who have better sensitivity for hearing, or are more vulnerable due to illnesses, age, or other things. The tough people can handle it, but they have to recognize that not everyone is there. I have a farmer who in Wisconsin, who when I first was out there, told me he was proud to have 3 wind turbines on his property. What he didn't know is that his wife was going to be the sensitive person. They're now divorced, and he's in the process of collecting data to sue the developer. So even if you think you're going to start as not having a problem, you can find someone in your family who is sensitive, and then it becomes a problem for you. So with that, I'm going to close, and I want to say thank you. I hope I wasn't too boring, but I wanted to show the problem as I see it. And I hope you learned something from that. Thank you.
All right, well, we certainly want to thank Mr. James and Mr. Martis for their presentations and their time today. But we do